Okay, Liz, it's your go.
You timed that perfectly, Joan. You said those words just as it said 2 o'clock. So, welcome, everyone. Welcome to this service, which is a joint effort. The Canadian Unitarian Council, specifically Joan Carolyn, who you just heard from, is hosting this service, so a thank you to them. And today's content is a collaboration between the Saskatoon Unitarians and Mirth and Dignity. I see several of you here from there as well. That's the organization that runs the humor group, the UU Hysterical Society. So a huge thank you to all of those organizations for helping put this service together. A couple quick housekeeping things before we start. The service is being recorded. If you don't want your image recorded, you can just go ahead and turn your video off. There is a couple of points where I'm going to be reading from the chat if people want to type things in there, and I will do that without including any names. Also, there's going to be a coffee time afterwards. You're welcome to either stay and talk with the presenters about the presentation from today, or also you'll be able to break out into smaller groups to touch base. And I'll talk about that again at the end. You don't have to remember that. We'll be doing singing several times in this service. I invite you to please stay muted. We won't mute you because that's not part of our theology and our values, but we affirm and promote that you mute yourselves. So I'll, without further ado, begin the service after those announcements. So welcome. Welcome. This is normally the part where I would say we gather with gratitude on Treaty 6 land and the homeland of the Métis, but of course we're gathering from all over. Some of us are on treaty land and some of us are on unceded territory. A treaty is an inheritance, a responsibility, and a relationship. And may we all be good neighbors to one another, good stewards of our shared land, and good ancestors to all of our children. Our chalice lighting this morning is from the Mirth and Dignity worship materials, read by one of our board members, Reverend Ann Barker. So we'll turn the screen over to her.
Thank you, Liz. So our chalice lighting words are actually written by Liz James, who is the founder and the inspired creator of the organization Mirth and Dignity and the UU Hysterical Society. You can find these words in the resources section of uuhystericalsociety.com and are welcome to share them in your own worlds and congregations. Broken, we carry each other home. Each Sunday, we light a chalice. We light a chalice to symbolize our faith and the light we aspire to bring to a hurting world, to bring comfort to those who are hurting, to bring understanding to those who are in darkness, to bring hope to, who are we kidding? This chalice is not a beacon. We do not bring the torch of light to a hurting world. We are not that special. We are, in my experience, about the same amount of good as the average flawed human being, and about 60% as much good as the average canine. This is the fire we gather around to do our best. Last week, I traveled to Boston, I stood on the banks of Walden Pond, and I wandered the halls of Harvard, where Emerson and Channing would have walked. I stood at the writing desk where Louisa May Alcott wrote Little Women, and all of the famous Unitarians and Universalists, it's Alcott that impresses me most. Louisa's writings contain just as much wisdom as the other guy's stuff, but she did it in plain language, telling stories from family life. And she did it all while doing her own laundry. I learned that Louisa's father encouraged his 4 daughters in ways that were unheard of for women at the time. He also ran a station for the Underground Railroad. He taught a child of color in his school. Amos Alcott and his wife and his daughters were indisputably some of the best of the good guys. I also learned that Louisa was very literally the dark sheep in the family during her childhood. Her father, despite being a strong abolitionist, had a conviction that light complexion was correlated with good moral character. Louisa was loud, boyish, and dark. She loved her dad, of course. You can see her deep regard for him in her writing. And he loved her deeply too, caring for her and provided her with untold opportunities and respect. I bet that made it even harder for her, being not quite good enough all the time. The tour guide tells me that their relationship changed after Louisa went off to act as a nurse in the war. In Little Women, it's the father who is fighting and gets sick, but in real life, it was Louisa. Her father was the one who went to get her and to bring her home to heal. I imagine him guarding and protecting her on that long journey home. I imagine him coming face to face with the fact that he might lose his daughter who had left everything she loved to try and save the lives of others. It was twilight that night, waiting for the train to take me back to Boston. I realized that they probably passed right through the very spot where I was standing. It was right here on that platform that Amos would have stood on the steps of the train, his arms around his daughter's thinning waist, shouldering her weight and guiding her carefully down the platform. I can see her in the twilight, leaning on his flawed and life-saving strength, and in all the complicatedness of that love. We do not light our chalice this morning in the spirit of the beacon to save the world. We do not light it because we are more special than anyone else. We light it in the spirit of the simple hearth fire that Amos carried his daughter home to, the complicated places we share, where we do our best. We are not saved by heroes. We are saved by broken people. Broken, we carry each other home. Thank you, Liz.
My screen said, the host would like you to unmute your microphone. Thank you, Anne. Our opening song this morning is Come, Come, Whoever You Are. The words are by the Sufi poet Rumi, and the tune is written also by a board member of Mirth and Dignity, Reverend Lynn Unger. I invite you to join in, muted, singing from home. Come, come, whoever you are, wanderer, worshiper, lover of leaving, ours is no caravan of despair. Come yet again, come, whoever you are, wanderer, worshiper, lover of leaving, ours is no caravan of despair. Come yet again, come, whoever you are, wanderer, worshiper, lover of leaving, ours is no caravan of despair. Come yet again, We're now at the point in our service for sharing joys and sorrows, celebrations and concerns in our lives. If we were meeting in Saskatoon, we'd be putting pebbles in a bowl of water, which I have right here. So I invite you to hold that image in your mind. If you have something to share, I invite you to type it into the chat while I am singing the Milestone song and accompanying myself on guitar, which will be interesting because I am not so much a great accompanist as the best accompanist that lives in my house, but we'll make do. And once you've had a minute or two to type, then I'll read out what people have written and put pebbles in the bowls of water, and I'll read without people's names. In Saskatoon, we have a tradition of concluding joys and sorrows with one final stone for what's unspoken. And then the leader, that's me, says, in our joy and in our sorrow, and you say, we don't journey alone. I'll finish with those words and I'll invite you to join in for that last line. So now is the time, if you have something to share about a joy or a concern in your life, to type that into the chat. In our strength and in our brokenness, we carry carry each other home. In our joy and in our sorrow, we do not journey alone. In our strength and in our brokenness, we carry each other home. In our joy and in our sorrow, we do not journey alone. In our strength and in our brokenness, we carry each other home. And in our joy and in our sorrow, we do not journey alone. And I'll read from the chat. Being a part-time, it'll take me a moment to scroll up to the right part in the chat. Gratitude for the blessings of humor in our lives. Prayers for all who are struggling. A joy to see so many friends and colleagues from across the country. Being a part-time care partner for a family with dementia is both a joy and a sorrow. Pray for families with children returning to in-person school. Hello from Florida. I had a milestone of meeting like-minded people yesterday. I'm missing festivals here in Edmonton, and my thoughts go out to artists that are hurting financially and emotionally without these festivals. Thoughts for my friend Janice and her husband in hospital, and also for those without health care. Joy in celebrating weird things. In Oxford, Mississippi, where we're struggling with the pandemic and racism, and so glad to be here now. Joy to meet the author of the opening words, which were read at my congregation this morning also. Joy of my great niece, Clark, born last week with both mom and her being healthy. Blessings to everyone from Cleveland, Ohio. Joy to be able to visit Saskatoon from the comfort of my home and see so many friends. Joy for tomatoes on the vine. Greetings from Southwestern Ontario. Joy for the bountiful harvest. In Carolina, where things are not going well, my sister and niece are both teachers. Just moved from the west coast to east, joy of new beginnings and sorrow of leaving. Grateful to have discovered Paint Branch UU Church fairly late in life. Sad that the UUs in Auckland, New Zealand are having to meet virtually again for a while, as Auckland is in shutdown for at least 12 days. Pray for the US, we need it. Gratitude to the UU Hysterical Society for bringing humor to my days. And Chalice Lit in San Diego, California, USA. And I'll put one final pebble in the water for all that we hold unspoken in our hearts. In our joy and in our sorrow, we don't journey alone. Our topic this morning is reverence for weird things. As a kid, I always wanted to be a Christian. My friend Carolyn went to church where if you were good, you got marshmallows and the love of Jesus, and if you were bad, you only got the love of Jesus. And I wanted to go, but I was pretty sure that we weren't church people in my family. Church families always started meals by telling Jesus about everything they were grateful for, and my family started meals with arguing about whose turn it was to do the dishes. Also, my family celebrated Santa Claus Christmas instead of Jesus Christmas, and I was pretty sure if you believed in God, you had to celebrate Jesus Christmas. And there was evolution. You had to believe in either God or evolution. That's how it worked. There were two big guys in the sky with white beards named Darwin and God, and if you chose the Darwin one, you believed about monkeys and the universe being really old, and if you chose the God one, you believed about a garden called Eden, and you said grace, and you went to church. Eventually, I worked up the courage to ask my mom if we believed in God in our family. I found her in the kitchen, my mom, not God, and I asked her the big question. And she stopped what she was doing and she stared into space really hard. And I thought maybe she was focusing on the question with her whole mind. She wasn't. It turned out she was actually trying to convert the butter in her recipe from grams to ounces. So I asked her again and she said, look, do you want me to answer this question about God or do you want me to focus on finishing this pie? So I left because the pie was more important, clearly. And I went to go find my dad, who my mom said, go find your father. He loves pointless questions with no answers. So I asked my dad, and he said that our family, or him actually, didn't believe in God the way Carolyn believed in God, but that he wanted to show me something. And he wrote this on a piece of paper. And he handed this to me and he said, for me, this is scripture. Well, I was 9. I didn't know what scripture was. So then my dad said, this is math. And I did know what math was, and this isn't math. The 0 and the equal and the 1, those are math. But E is clearly language arts, and so is I, which my dad said stands for imaginary numbers, which is clearly a mistake because you're not supposed to use your imagination in math class. Everybody knows that. And then he said that this squiggly thing is a drawing of a pie, which clearly it's not. How hard is it to draw a pie, Dad? It's just a circle. So I told my dad to make an effort. And my dad told me that someday I would grow up and I would take advanced mathematics and I would learn to understand this equation. And I did grow up. And I did take advanced mathematics and I still have no clue what that equation really means. But I do know this. I know that the face my dad made when he told me about the laws of physics and mathematics held that same look of reverence that I see on the faces of people who are at worship. Science made my dad a part of something so huge and so elegant that it is a miracle it even exists. And it's a miracle that we get to understand even this tiny little piece of it that we do understand. It's a miracle that we get to understand even this tiny sliver that we do understand. And it's a miracle that we get to use math and science to take that understanding and join together to travel through space and build bridges and save people's lives. It's a miracle how science allows us to be part of this journey that reaches deep into history and far into the future. And we think of science and religion as in opposition to each other. But when people talk like that, I think of my dad and the expression on his face as he drew that incomprehensible set of squiggles on the page and handed it to me with all the reverence of a man handling scripture. This drawing that to him was the shadow of God cast across the page so that it could be seen by humans. It's not the same for each of us. Science isn't everyone's reverent thing. I know for sure it's not mine, but we each have these moments of things that bring out this sense of awe and reverence, these things that are sacred. And I invite you to take a moment and think, what are those things for you? Those moments and those stories. While you are thinking, 3 people from Saskatoon Unitarians are going to answer this question for them this morning. Betty Turnier-Daniels will talk first, and then we will go straight to Fiona Butler-Bird. And after a break for a song, we'll hear from some members of the UU Hysterical Society, and then Reverend Fulgence Ndadijimana.
My first response when Liz asked me to talk about reverence for weird things was astonishment. I have a passionate interest in the preservation of small farms and rural communities. Since when, I ask myself, is that weird? Most Saskatchewan people my age, at least those of us from a settler culture, either grew up on a farm or spent time visiting grandparents on the farm. Like wheat pool elevators, farms were part of the prairie landscape. They were ordinary places where people lived and worked. They certainly weren't weird. But cultures change, and prairie culture today, like that of the rest of the world, is increasingly urban. Small farms and tiny rural communities have become anachronisms. Maybe there is something weird about my reverence for rural Saskatchewan family farm. Nostalgia could help account for my desire to preserve a vanishing culture. Like 2 of my siblings, I've lived most of my life as the 3rd generation on our farm in Northwest Saskatchewan. But now, 46 years after we made it our home, my husband and I have retired. Our kids, like most of their rural and urban counterparts, don't want to farm. What should we do with the land? To sell or not to sell? The family farm may be a sacred icon of settler culture, but the population shift from rural to urban challenges sentimental endorsements of farming and small town life. In Saskatchewan, as in the rest of the country, the number of farmers is lower than it's ever been, and it continues to decline. Family farms are disappearing and rural communities are dying as local economies fade and people move to the cities. If I could know that my farm would be purchased and cherished by another farmer, a decision to sell would not be so difficult. But landholding corporations are buying farmland, and that worries me. It's not just that they drive up prices, it's also that enormous holdings confer power. When agricultural land is decreasing and demand for food is increasing, big landholding corporations control access to food, and their land base is growing. I don't want the Turney Daniels farm to become part of a corporate fiefdom. In order to save rural Saskatchewan, we need young people who want to farm. That means we not only have to make startup costs affordable, we also have to make rural life more attractive. My love affair with repopulating the sparsely inhabited prairie landscape started when, as a child, my sister and I imagined putting houses on every quarter section of our family farm. Later, in university, I wrote a paper titled Proposal for a Stable State Village and Farming Community, and located my Arcadian settlement in my home territory of the Northwest Parkland. Such dreams, however, proved hard to realize. Cannington Manor, established in 1882 by upper-class English immigrants, and the cooperative community of Harmona, created in 1895, both flourished briefly but were soon abandoned. Equally unsuccessful were the cooperative farms initiated by the Saskatchewan CCF in order to make rural life sufficiently attractive to keep our young people on the farm. Few of them lasted more than one generation, and none of them exist today. My attempts to attract people to our farm has also failed. I was about to conclude that the revitalization of rural Saskatchewan is a lost cause. Then I read a study by the Post-Carbon Institute. It argues that the future is rural, that the ecological costs of burning fossil fuels will force us to return to a small-scale agrarian way of life. Great, I said to myself, but it's not going to happen in my lifetime. Enter the COVID-19 pandemic. I'd like to think that something good could come from something so hard. Could it possibly mark a turning point in our demographical and cultural history? The pandemic has already shown us the fragility of our food system and contributed to an increased demand for local food. But can it spur the development of a vast network of sustainable farm communities? Although success is unlikely, I can't sell my farm because it provides the land base that could help realize that dream. In the meantime, Doug and I have to make some decisions. Will the pandemic increase the desirability of farming in rural life? Impossible to say. But if it does, well, anybody want to help me start an incubator farm?
Hi everyone, my name's Fiona, my pronouns are she, her, and I'm a UU youth. I remember when I first felt spiritual and like I was connected to the larger faith of Unitarian Universalism. I was 12 and it was my first con, which is the weekend in the fall that overlaps with Western Regional Fall Gathering, where youth from all over the Western region get together. And I was walking into my very first youth worship. It was set up in the sanctuary of the Winnipeg Church. It was probably around 11 p.m. and I was exhausted from the 10-hour drive and all the excitement of the new environment. We sat in the candlelit sanctuary together and we sang and we meditated and we did an activity where we passed around a string and everyone added a bead, and if you wanted, you shared a personal story about a time you felt othered. It doesn't sound like much, but it felt like everything. At that point in my life, I wasn't one to speak up in those situations, but that day I did because I really felt like I was contributing to the space we were creating. I say this in the best way possible. It felt like I was on drugs. I was in another dimension of soft light and soft voices, and even though I barely knew anyone's names, I felt so deeply connected to them. And that's where UU Youth find our religious faith, in each other. In the spaces we share, the traditions we create, and the community we build. In my 7 years in the youth world, I realized that's what makes this step in our UU lives so special. We experience and practice our faith not as individuals, but as a community. We have an endless list of traditions, ceremonies, and rituals we've developed as a national community over the years which stem from this unique way of practicing faith. And these practices would not be nearly as meaningful or fulfilling if not for the youth around us participating in them alongside us. I never feel as spiritual or as connected to my faith as I do when I'm with my youth community. On top of Con in the fall, there's also Canoodle over May-long weekend for youth all across the country. Every second of both Cons and Canoodles is steeped in tradition and sacredness. Some of these traditions are what you might think of when you hear that word. The worships like the ones I described earlier, the quiet, reflective moments of connecting spiritually to each other and ourselves. But as a community, that's not all we find sacredness in. In fact, as UU Youth, we hold reverence for just about everything we do. Every year at Canoodle, we have a dance party that's such a blast. I think once I'm old enough to go clubbing, it'll be a bit of a disappointment. It's always one of the highlights of the weekend, and we all look forward to it. We use basically the same playlist every year of Britney Spears, ABBA, and to close out the night, the Time Warp. Everyone dances until they're out of breath and could definitely use a shower while singing at the top of their lungs. It's a fun and low-pressure way to interact with people you haven't gotten to yet, and for us all to bond over a shared love of songs and moving to them. In many ways, I feel the same sacred connection to the community we create at Canoodle during the dance as I do during worship, just at a different noise level. There are so many examples just like this of times where we find spiritualness and reverence in the silliness, the excitement, and the chaos, as well as the quiet, the calm, the reflective, and everything in between. Because it's with each other we are most connected to UUism. As long as we're together, everything is a spiritual practice. I feel so lucky that I got to spend my youthhood surrounded by people that make me so at home in this faith, and that give sacredness to anything just because we're together in community.
Thank you so much, Fiona, and thank you so much, Betty. Before we hear from Fulgence, we're going to do one more song. This is Building Bridges, which I chose because it's a song that I first heard youth singing, and the love that I see in that community when they share this song is something I find really inspiring. So I invite you to sing along, muted. I won't be muted even though there is a voice in the recording, because if I mute myself, you can't hear the recording.
Building bridges between our divisions. If I reach out to you, will you reach out to me? With all of our voices and all of our visions, friends, we can make such sweet.
Okay, so then next up is Reverend Fulgence. And so why don't we go to Reverend Fulgence while Liz does magical things with her computer or logs in on her phone, or we'll just make up the rest of the service as we go along, because that would be funny. Over to you, Fulgence.
There is a widespread story in the area where I come from in Burundi, Central Africa. It is about a missionary, a Belgian missionary, who was testing people's readiness for baptism to the Roman Catholic faith. One elder who had been training seriously came for the test. The obvious question was to make sure the elder knew the basics that he was created by God in her own image. Who made you? The missionary asked. My parents, my neighbors, elders in the community, the prince who recognized my bravery, gave me cows and decorated me. All those people made me who I am, the elder replied. With a look on his face, the missionary asked again, but who really made you? I have already told you, replied the frustrated elder. The missionary had to make a decision. He was testing him. So he said, you have failed the test. You will have to go back to the religious education classes. The elder remained silent for a moment and then said, no, I have not failed. You have failed, you who talk nonsense and are a robe-wearing man. Obviously, the elder never got to be baptized. The missionary expected a dive into the science of original causes. The elder was practical and realistic. He knew some things, he did not know other things. He knew he did not make himself. He could name people who played a significant part, and he was aware of many, many more people he could not name. He was living the philosophy of Ubuntu that says, I am because you are. I am made by other people. Every time I think about sacredness, I go back to the philosophy of Ubuntu. Life is inextricably connected. And at my best, this philosophy inspires and motivates my action. On the day I was kidnapped, I remember being brought to the police station. After 11 years of interrogation and torture, I was hungry and thirsty. I was scared, and I saw Ubuntu at work. People from the community gathered, and a woman from the gathered group who saw how desperate I was ran home, brought 3 donuts, milk, and a soft drink. That brought back life in me. I do not know her name, and I don't think she cares. I do not have her contacts, and that's okay. It is okay because I know when I meet a person in need, I remember that the best truth is that we are connected. And the best calling for me at the moment is for me to care. Framing Charity International was born out of that experience of sacrifice, love, and care from people known and unknown, but who are all convinced that we are connected. My work with refugees is inspired by Ubuntu. And the work is not just an opportunity to give back, but a recognition that pain and suffering are not only private, and therefore they require a collective response. Ubuntu reminds us that everyone has a role to play in shaping the reality. It is a noble duty and a sacred calling. Unitarian Universalism offers a space where I get connected to so many people, to all of you, and I get motivated to carry out my calling. We are all blessed to be connected. to one another.
So here we go. A week ago, I told the story about my dad in the UU Hysterical Society and invited people to write about what's sacred to them. There were hundreds of responses, and I can't read them all, but I'd like to share a few with you. What feels sacred? Quantum mechanics, the standard model of elementary particles, general relativity, the recording of Miles Davis's Second Great Quintet. Dogs work calculus to predict where a frisbee will alight. I think dogs are a metaphor or corporeal example for God. Our family's wealth is and always, but always has been harmony of the singing kind. It's not like a religious belief, it actually is one. If I can't have harmony singing, I don't want your revolution, nor your religion. I can't really even make a story about it. I am reminded of our nephew about age 6 when grace was said. He thanked God for the hamburger, the mashed potatoes, the green beans, etc. Then when finished, he asked the adults, "What about the bad stuff?" I've used that in the theodicy part of my world religions class a lot. Personally, I have always wished I could find faith, but I have never felt it. A wise older woman once told me that because I lived my life trying to do good works, despite the fact that I felt nothing in return was faith. So I stuck with that. When I am contra dancing, I feel a oneness with everyone in the room as we move in similar ways at the same time. It feels like I have slipped into a pocket of energy, symmetry, and harmony. When I was very young, before I could walk, I danced, but it was not just part of me, I was dance. It's hard to explain except that it's left me and I have reverberations from having been dance. I'm nearly 70 now, and I still remember the sense of limitlessness when I danced, not just connection between separate entities, but complete immersion into everything. That sounds like that youth story we just heard. The feeling when I'm holding a baby. When Father explained that water, the basis of life as we know it, is the only substance that expands as it freezes. If it contracted, it would sink to the bottom forever and no life. Since it floats, it melts as it warms. Without this one exception to a law, we would not exist. As a 1950s child in Birmingham, Michigan, the herd of children from Holland Street would play in a place nearby called The Field. Within the wonders of the place was an oak called Acres Tree, presumably because the crown covered an acre. The first time I saw it, I was probably 5 or 6, and I was struck with the awe of this magnificent thing in the world that was alive. I also remember once joining hands with all of the neighborhood kids and encircling the tree in a group embrace. Yes, I still sometimes chat with the trees. Every now and then, when I'm feeling especially in tune with the world, I pick up something at the grocery store, something complicated like a box of cake mix. I think about all the earth did to create the things in that box. The wheat, the corn, the sugar, the cocoa. I think about all the hands, the ones that planted and harvested, the ones that processed, the ones developed the chemical elements, some of which are mysteries to me. I think about the people at Betty Crocker, from the office staff to the production workers. I think about the hands that loaded the truck, the driver on the roads, the hands that placed the boxes on the shelf. And I feel simultaneously insignificant and important. All that for the cake I will bake with my 2 hands and serve to my family. If that's not holy, I don't know what is. Eggs. Why does something that becomes a chicken also sometimes become popovers and lemon meringue pie? Wouldn't the hens be... Oops, it fell off. Wouldn't the hen... There's a mystery. Wouldn't the hens be what? And I'm going to go on to the next page that starts somewhere else. I have been crocheting for 25 years, and I am self-taught on reading the language of crochet. It amazes me when I see so many beautiful patterns, and I'm still mystified on this day on how these unique and complex patterns are created. Monarch butterflies migrate from upper US and Canada to winter in central Mexico. That is amazing. But what gets me is that the butterflies that leave North America are not the ones that arrive in Mexico. It takes 3 generations to make the trip. I didn't know that. How the destination is passed from one to the next is an elegant mystery to me. My dad was like that about woodworking. He always got a reverent look on his face when he first handled the wood of a new project. I asked him about it once, and he told me he was thinking about the decades that the tree the wood came from had lived, and if he did justice to the wood, it would last and be used for decades after he was gone. And our final reflection, I was attending a friend's wedding in Scotland. I was about 23 at the time. Midway through the service, the minister, who had to have been at least 65 years old, started to cry. He looked at the congregation and said, I have performed over 100 weddings in my lifetime, and I have cried at every one of them because it is such a blessing to bind 2 people together in love. As I watched and listened to him, I was struck by the realization that this man had a soul and was showing it to us. It was a truly powerful and profound moment.
Our organization for the offering this morning is Flaming Chalice International, which is a not-for-profit that Reverend Fulgence created when he arrived in Canada to help some of the people that were left behind when he came here as a refugee. And they do incredible work. And one of the magical things, one of the reasons why I support Flaming Chalice International is how effective it is to take someone who's helping using funds, who's already in that community, who knows people, who knows the culture, who knows how traditions work. And that allows this organization to be incredibly effective on a very tight budget. So that's why we chose that one to support this morning. The song that's going to play during the offering is Holy Now, which is by Peter Mayer. And it's a song that's available for use by congregations in worship. I love it. It speaks to this theme of sacredness. And they ask that you make a small donation when you use it. As we're doing the offering, I invite you to also think about your own, the things that are reverent to you, and to type those into the chat, and then I'll read them out just as I did with the milestones once the offering is done. Go ahead, Joan. Thank you, everyone, for your wonderful responses, and to Peter Mayer, whose song Holy Now is what you would Google if you wanted to use that. And I don't know if I said it, but thank you to Anne for jumping in, pinch hitting, and reading the script, which I sent to her by email. From the chat responses, music, the universal language touching all hearts, the last thing left in memory. The magic of meeting on the interweb for worship, when just months ago we thought that was impossible-ish. Sitting at the sea and letting the breeze flow over me, or walking amongst trees and knowing that everything is so much greater than me and us. The river and music, but not country music, sorry. Mandolins, a crown of tall evergreens at Seabeck, Washington. Maybe brings UU magic to people who've never heard of us, or UUs. It's hard to tell which is being said there. Nature. Thank you for delightful time from Florida. Walking through the nature preserve across the street from my house, the interdependent web of all existence. So glad to know people around the world can come together, and COVID has a silver lining of getting us more used to technology. The beautiful way the CUC has found the energy to bring independent beings into the community this summer. Ocean waves, walking in the meadows and forest beside my home along the river, marveling at the wonder of it all. Birds welcoming the day before the sun has even peaked above the horizon. Kiddos that sleep through this service even when they pester me through my regular congregations. Singing in harmony. The miracle of seeing a live presentation from Saskatoon, which I've never been within 1,000 kilometers of. Thank you. We have a tradition in our culture of asking people what they do for a living as we get to know them. And what a different world this would be if instead we asked one another for our stories of what is reverend. In the words of one member of the UU Historical Society in the comment thread that Anne read from earlier, my grandfather was a humanist. My grandmother was a Protestant who loved church. One Sunday, my grandfather was pruning flowers and said to me, "What I love is that your grandmother loves." And that was his church. I've never forgotten that. May we journey out into the world carrying love for whatever is sacred to us, and also love for whatever is sacred to our neighbors.